Sometimes a person wakes up one day and realizes something subtle but undeniable has shifted inside them. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that can easily be explained to the people around them. It's quieter than that, more personal. You might notice it during ordinary moments. Maybe you're sitting in your car after finishing a long day, and instead of immediately turning on music or checking your phone, you pause. There's a strange calm in the silence. Your thoughts feel deeper than they used to. You begin reflecting on your life in a way you didn't before. Or maybe you're in a room full of people, and something about the energy feels different. Conversations that once felt exciting now feel shallow. Situations that once pulled your attention now feel strangely distant. Nothing outside has dramatically changed, but inside something has. And if you felt that shift recently, you might have noticed something else too. The story you've been telling yourself about your life may not be the full story. For years, most people move through life reacting to what happens around them. They follow patterns that feel familiar. They adopt identities based on expectations, environment, and the opinions of others. School tells you who you should become. Work tells you what success should look like. Social circles quietly shape the way you talk, think, and even dream. At first, none of this seems unusual. It's simply the way life works. Everyone does it. But eventually, some people begin noticing something strange. They realize that the version of themselves they've been showing the world isn't necessarily the deepest version of who they are. And when that realization begins, it doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds slowly, like pieces of a story finally being revealed. Understanding the missing chapters. Think about a book where someone reads only the middle chapters. They know the characters. They see the events unfolding, but they don't fully understand why certain things are happening. Without the beginning of the story, some moments seem confusing, some reactions seem unexpected, some turning points feel random. But once the missing chapters are revealed, everything suddenly makes sense. In many ways, personal growth works the same way. For a long time, you may have been living from the middle chapters of your own story. You experienced challenges. You navigated relationships. You adapted to different environments. But the deeper understanding of why certain experiences shaped you the way they did may not have been clear yet. That clarity usually arrives later. And when it does, it changes the way you see everything that came before. Suddenly, moments that once felt confusing start connecting together. Conversations you had years ago start making more sense. Decisions you made begin revealing hidden lessons you couldn't see at the time. It's like stepping back and realizing your life wasn't a random sequence of events. It was a process, a long process of discovering who you actually are. The quiet distance that appears during growth. One of the most common experiences people describe during periods of deep personal change is a feeling of distance. Not physical distance, internal distance. You might still be surrounded by the same people. You might still live in the same city. Your daily routine might even look almost identical from the outside. But internally, something feels different. Topics that once held your attention don't pull you in the same way anymore. Arguments that used to bother you now feel less important. Certain habits begin fading without you even forcing yourself to stop them. At first, this shift can feel confusing. You may wonder if something is wrong. You might question whether you're becoming too serious or too detached. But what's actually happening is something far more natural. Your awareness is expanding. And when awareness expands, it changes the way you interact with the world around you. Think about how children see the world. A small disagreement might feel enormous. A simple toy can hold their full attention for hours. Their perspective is built around immediate experience. But as people grow older, their perspective widens. They begin seeing patterns. They recognize long-term consequences. They understand emotional complexity in ways they couldn't before. The same thing happens during deeper personal development. Your mind begins noticing layers beneath surface-level situations. You become more aware of motivations, both your own and those of others. You start recognizing emotional patterns that repeat themselves in relationships, workplaces, and everyday interactions. Once you see those patterns, it becomes difficult to pretend they aren't there. And that awareness naturally creates a little space between who you were and who you're becoming. Why reflection often begins after discomfort. Another part of the story many people don't talk about openly is that reflection usually doesn't begin during the easiest chapters of life. More often, it begins after something uncomfortable happens. A disappointment, a misunderstanding, a period where things don't go according to plan. These moments tend to slow people down. They interrupt the routine. They create a pause where questions start appearing. Why did that situation affect me the way it did? What was I really hopping for? Was I reacting to the present moment or to something deeper? Questions like these can feel uncomfortable at first, but they also open the door to kind of clarity that's difficult to reach during fast-moving periods of life. When people slow down enough to reflect honestly, they begin seeing themselves more clearly. Not just the version they present to the world, but the deeper motivations beneath their actions. That level of self-awareness can be surprising. Sometimes it reveals strengths you didn't realize you had. Other times it reveals patterns you've been unconsciously repeating for years. Neither realization is negative. Both are part of understanding the full story. Because every meaningful transformation begins with awareness. The turning point most people don't recognize. There's a moment during personal growth that often passes quietly. No celebration, no dramatic announcement, just a subtle internal shift. It's the moment when someone stops trying to force themselves into roles that don't feel natural anymore. For years, people often adjust themselves to fit expectations. They say yes when they want to say no. They pursue goals that sound impressive, but don't actually feel fulfilling. They stay connected to environments that drain them simply because leaving would feel uncomfortable. But eventually, something changes. You start recognizing the difference between external approval and internal alignment. And once that difference becomes clear, certain choices become easier. Not always easy, but clearer. You begin valuing honesty with yourself more than maintaining appearances. You start prioritizing peace of mind over constant validation. You realize that growth sometimes requires stepping away from situations that once felt familiar. This realization doesn't turn someone into a completely different person overnight, but it does begin shaping the next chapters of their story. Because once someone sees their own path more clearly, it becomes difficult to walk blindly in directions that don't feel right anymore. The layers beneath identity. For most of life, identity is built from external references. People describe themselves based on roles, their job, their background, their social circle, their responsibilities. There's nothing wrong with these descriptions. They're part of reality. But they don't always capture the deeper layers of who someone truly is. During periods of reflection, many people begin noticing that their identity has been evolving quietly beneath the surface. The version of yourself that existed 5 years ago may have been focused on different priorities, different fears, different ambitions. That version of you made choices based on the understanding you had at the time. But growth means your understanding continues expanding. And when understanding expands, identity naturally evolves. This is where some of the most important realizations happen. You begin separating the expectations you inherited from the values you genuinely believe in. You start noticing which parts of your personality feel authentic and which parts were shaped mainly by external pressure. This process can take time, sometimes years, but it gradually leads to something powerful: clarity. And clarity changes everything. Because when someone understands themselves more clearly, they stop searching for direction in the same places they once did. They begin trusting their own perspective more. They become less reactive to temporary noise. And they develop a stronger sense of internal stability. That stability doesn't mean life suddenly becomes perfect. Challenges still appear. Unexpected situations still happen. But the way you respond to those moments begins changing. Instead of reacting automatically, you pause. You observe. You consider what truly matters in the long run. And in that pause, you begin realizing something important. The story you thought you were living may only have been part of a much larger narrative. A narrative that continues unfolding with every choice you make, every lesson you learn, and every moment you choose awareness over autopilot. And that's where the deeper chapters of the story truly begin, recognizing the moments that quietly change you. If you look back at different seasons of your life, you may start noticing something interesting. The moments that changed you the most weren't always the loudest ones. They weren't always the big milestones everyone celebrates. Sometimes the real turning points were quiet, almost invisible at the time. A conversation that stayed in your mind longer than expected. A moment when someone said something simple, yet it made you see yourself differently. Or a situation where you realized your reaction had changed compared to how you would have responded years earlier. Growth often hides in moments like that, not dramatic enough to announce themselves as transformation, but significant enough to slowly reshape how you think. Many people overlook these moments because they're waiting for something bigger. They expect change to feel like a sudden breakthrough. But more often, growth feels like a gradual adjustment in perspective. You begin noticing patterns you never paid attention to before. You begin questioning assumptions that once felt obvious. And slowly, your relationship with the world starts shifting. Not because the world changed overnight, but because the lens you're looking through has evolved. Why some people begin seeing through surface-level situations. One of the interesting effects of increased awareness is that everyday situations start revealing deeper layers. At first, this can feel surprising. You might notice emotional patterns in conversations that previously seemed normal. You might recognize when someone is reacting from stress rather than intention. You might even catch yourself before responding impulsively to something that once would have triggered a strong reaction. This doesn't mean you suddenly become detached from life. It means your perspective expands. Think about watching a movie for the second time. During the first viewing, you're focused mainly on what happens next. But when you watch it again, you start noticing details you missed before. Subtle expressions, background conversations, clues that hinted at the ending long before it arrived. Life can feel similar when awareness deepens. Situations that once seemed confusing begin revealing patterns. You start recognizing the emotional rhythms people move through. Moments of frustration begin making more sense when you see the pressure someone else might be carrying. Even your own reactions begin revealing deeper motivations. Instead of simply asking, "Why did that happen?" you start asking, "What does this situation reveal?" That shift in perspective may sound small, but it changes the way you experience almost everything. The difference between reaction and response. One of the most noticeable signs of personal growth is the difference between reacting and responding. A reaction happens quickly. It's driven by habit. Emotion rises, and the mind immediately moves to defend, explain, or counter whatever just occurred. For many years, people operate mostly in reaction mode. Someone criticizes them, and they instantly feel defensive. Someone disagrees with them, and tension appears. Someone misunderstands them, and they rush to explain themselves. There's nothing unusual about this. It's simply how the mind protects its sense of identity. But over time, something interesting begins happening. You start creating a small space between the moment something happens and the way you respond to it. In that space, you begin asking different questions. Is this situation actually worth my energy? What is this person really trying to express? What outcome would I actually prefer here? That pause changes everything. Because when you pause long enough to think clearly, your response becomes intentional rather than automatic. Sometimes that means speaking calmly instead of arguing. Sometimes it means letting something go instead of holding onto frustration. And sometimes it means recognizing that not every situation deserves your full emotional investment. Learning to respond instead of react doesn't happen overnight. It develops through experience, through moments when you look back and realize how you could have handled something differently, through conversations that show you new ways of seeing things, and through a growing awareness of how powerful your attention truly is, the quiet power of letting certain things go. There's a stage in personal growth where people begin releasing things they once held onto tightly, opinions that once felt urgent to defend, conflicts that once seemed impossible to walk away from, expectations that once defined their sense of success. Letting go doesn't mean giving up on your values. It means becoming more selective about where you place your energy. Many people spend years feeling like they must prove themselves constantly. They try to win every argument. They try to correct every misunderstanding. They try to make sure everyone sees them the right way. But eventually, a realization appears. Not everyone will understand you. Not everyone will see things the way you do. And surprisingly, that's completely okay. Once you accept that reality, something shifts internally. You stop chasing universal approval. You stop exhausting yourself trying to control how others interpret your actions. Instead, you focus on living in a way that feels honest and consistent with your own values. That internal shift creates a kind of calm confidence. Not arrogance, not indifference, just a steady understanding that your worth isn't determined by every passing opinion. And once that understanding settles in, life starts feeling lighter. Why growth sometimes feels like solitude. Another experience many people encounter during deeper personal change is a period where they feel slightly out of sync with their surroundings. Not completely disconnected, but different enough that it's noticeable. Conversations that once felt engaging may start feeling repetitive. Certain social dynamics begin revealing patterns you hadn't noticed before. Activities that once filled your schedule might not feel as meaningful anymore. This stage can feel confusing if you don't recognize what's happening. You might wonder if you're becoming too distant. You might question whether something about you has changed in a negative way. But in many cases, what's really happening is that your priorities are evolving. Growth naturally reshapes what captures your attention. It changes the types of conversations you enjoy. It alters the environments where you feel most comfortable. And sometimes, during that transition, there's a period where you're no longer fully connected to the old patterns, but you haven't completely built the new ones yet. That in-between space can feel like solitude, but it's often temporary. It's simply the mind reorganizing itself around new insights. As you continue exploring those insights, new connections begin forming. Conversations become deeper. Friendships become more intentional. Experiences begin aligning more naturally with the direction you're moving in. But before that alignment appears, there's often a quiet stage where reflection becomes more important than constant activity. Learning to trust your own perspective. One of the most meaningful shifts people describe during long-term personal development is the moment they start trusting their own perspective more fully. For much of life, external validation plays a powerful role in shaping decisions. People look for approval before feeling confident in their choices. They seek reassurance before stepping into unfamiliar territory. They measure their progress based on how others react. This is natural. Humans are social beings, and feedback from others helps us navigate the world. But there comes a point where relying entirely on external validation begins limiting personal growth. Because sometimes the path that feels most honest for you doesn't immediately make sense to everyone else. Your interests may change. Your goals may evolve. Your definition of success may begin looking different from the expectations you once followed. During those moments, trusting your own perspective becomes essential. Not blindly ignoring advice, not rejecting the value of other viewpoints, but recognizing that your internal compass has become stronger through experience. You've learned from challenges. You've reflected on mistakes. You've spent time understanding what truly matters to you. That process creates wisdom, and wisdom allows you to make decisions that feel aligned with your deeper values rather than temporary pressure. When someone reaches this stage, they often notice something interesting. Life becomes less about proving something to others and more about living in a way that feels meaningful from the inside out. That shift might not be obvious to everyone around you, but internally, it changes the entire experience of moving through the world. Because instead of constantly asking, "What will people think?" you begin asking a different question. Does this direction feel honest to who I've become? And when you start answering that question with clarity, the next chapters of your story begin unfolding in ways that feel far more authentic than anything that came before. Looking back at the earlier versions of yourself. At some point during deep reflection, many people begin thinking about who they used to be. Not in a judgmental way, more like observing an old photograph. You remember how you used to approach certain situations, the things that used to bother you, the things you used to chase. And sometimes you realize that the person you were back then was simply doing the best they could with the awareness they had at that time. That realization is important because growth isn't about criticizing your past self. It's about understanding the journey that brought you here. Think about the version of you from several years ago. That person had different priorities, different fears, different ideas about what mattered most. Maybe they were focused on gaining approval. Maybe they were trying to fit into spaces that never quite felt natural. Maybe they believed success looked a certain way because that's what everyone around them seemed to be pursuing. None of that makes the past version of you wrong. It simply means you are still learning. Every experience, every conversation, every challenge added another layer to your understanding. And those layers eventually brought you to the point where you could begin seeing things differently. Growth rarely happens in a straight line. It's more like a series of realizations that slowly reshape your perspective. Sometimes you take steps forward. Sometimes you repeat patterns before recognizing them clearly. Sometimes you think you've figured everything out, only to discover there are deeper levels of understanding waiting ahead. But every stage contributes to the story, even the confusing ones. Why certain patterns become visible over time. One of the reasons people begin reflecting more deeply later in life is because patterns start becoming easier to recognize. When you're inside a situation for the first time, everything feels immediate. You're focused on responding to what's happening right now. But after you've experienced similar situations multiple times, something interesting begins happening. You start noticing familiar emotional rhythms. Maybe you see how certain types of conversations always seem to follow the same path. Maybe you recognize how specific environments tend to bring out certain behaviors in people. Or maybe you notice patterns in your own decisions that you didn't realize were repeating. These realizations aren't meant to create regret. They're meant to create awareness. Once you see a pattern clearly, you gain the ability to change how you respond to it. For example, someone might notice that they used to rush into commitments too quickly because they didn't want to disappoint anyone. Once they recognize that pattern, they can begin approaching decisions more thoughtfully. Someone else might realize they spent years avoiding difficult conversations because conflict made them uncomfortable. After noticing that pattern, they may start practicing clearer communication. Patterns are simply information. They reveal how we've been navigating the world. And when that information becomes visible, it gives us the chance to evolve. The role of quiet self-observation. Most people spend a large part of their lives focused on external activity, work responsibilities, family commitments, daily routines, social obligations. All of these things require attention. But personal insight often appears during the quieter moments in between. Times when you're not rushing toward the next task. Moments when you allow your mind to observe rather than constantly react. During those quiet moments, your thoughts begin connecting different pieces of your experience. You remember situations that once confused you. You replay conversations that left an impression. You consider how your mindset has changed over time. At first, this type of reflection might feel unfamiliar. Many people aren't used to sitting with their thoughts without distraction. But over time, it becomes one of the most valuable habits a person can develop. Because self-observation allows you to understand your own mind. It helps you see what motivates you, what drains you, what genuinely inspires you. Without that level of awareness, people often spend years pursuing goals that don't truly reflect who they are. They follow paths that look successful on the surface, but feel empty internally. Reflection helps prevent that. It helps align your external actions with your internal values. And that alignment creates a sense of direction that feels far more stable than chasing temporary expectations. When your definition of success begins changing, there's a moment during personal development when the idea of success starts shifting. Earlier in life, success is often defined by visible achievements. A certain job title, a certain level of financial stability, recognition from others. These goals can be motivating, and many people pursue them with dedication. But as awareness grows, another dimension of success begins appearing. People start asking questions like, does this lifestyle actually support the kind of person I want to become? Am I building something meaningful, or am I simply following momentum? Do the environments around me encourage growth, or do they keep repeating the same cycles? These questions don't reject ambition. They refine it. Instead of chasing goals that look impressive externally, people begin pursuing experiences that feel meaningful internally. Sometimes that means adjusting priorities. Sometimes it means redefining what progress looks like. For example, someone might realize that peace of mind matters more than constant competition. Someone else might discover that creativity matters more than recognition. Another person might find that meaningful relationships matter more than appearing successful on paper. These realizations reshape the direction of life, not because someone told you to change your priorities, but because your own understanding naturally evolved. And once that evolution begins, the way you measure progress becomes more personal, more intentional, more connected to who you truly are. The strength that comes from self-understanding. As people continue exploring their own experiences, they often discover a kind of strength that doesn't come from external validation. It comes from self-understanding. When you understand your own patterns, you're less likely to be surprised by your reactions. When you understand your values, decisions become clearer. When you understand your boundaries, relationships become healthier. Self-understanding also creates emotional stability. Situations that once caused confusion begin making more sense. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by every unexpected moment, you begin navigating challenges with more clarity. You recognize that not every problem requires immediate action. Not every disagreement needs to become a personal conflict. Not every opportunity is actually aligned with your direction. This perspective creates space for thoughtful decision-making. And thoughtful decisions tend to lead to more consistent outcomes over time. That doesn't mean life becomes predictable. It simply means you're approaching it with greater awareness. Why awareness changes the way you see other people. As personal insight grows, something else begins shifting as well. The way you see other people. When you're younger or less experienced, it's easy to interpret situations only from your own perspective. If someone acts impatiently, it might feel like they're intentionally being difficult. If someone misunderstands you, it might feel like they're ignoring what you're saying. But as your awareness expands, you begin recognizing that everyone carries their own internal world. Every person has experiences that shape the way they think. Every person has pressures, worries, and expectations influencing their behavior. Understanding this doesn't mean you excuse harmful behavior, but it does create empathy. You start realizing that many reactions come from stress rather than intention. Many misunderstandings come from different perspectives rather than disrespect. And many conflicts could be resolved simply through clearer communication. This shift in perspective often changes the emotional tone of interactions. Instead of immediately assuming the worst, you become more curious about what might be happening beneath the surface. That curiosity leads to calmer conversations. It leads to better listening. And it often leads to solutions that wouldn't have appeared during reactive arguments. Awareness doesn't make life perfect, but it does make life more understandable. And when life becomes more understandable, navigating it becomes far less exhausting. The gradual emergence of inner stability. As these realizations accumulate over time, something steady begins forming beneath the surface of everyday life. A kind of inner stability. Not the rigid stability that comes from refusing to change, but the flexible stability that comes from understanding yourself clearly. You begin trusting your ability to adapt. You begin trusting your judgment. You begin trusting that even when unexpected situations arise, you'll be able to navigate them thoughtfully. This kind of stability isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself, but it becomes noticeable in subtle ways. You handle pressure more calmly. You recover from setbacks more quickly. You approach new experiences with curiosity rather than fear. And perhaps most importantly, you stop feeling like you need to rush your life to keep up with anyone else's timeline. You realize that growth happens at its own pace. Understanding unfolds layer by layer. And the story you're living continues evolving with every insight you gain along the way. If any part of this reflection felt familiar to you, take a moment to think about where you are in your own journey right now. Growth looks different for everyone, and sometimes the most powerful insights come from simply sharing perspectives. If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. And if conversations like this help you reflect a little deeper, consider staying connected here for more discussions like this in the future.